do at this point as a way of perhaps making an attempt to write in balance is to see first if there are those among us who have not had opportunities or taken opportunities to share, want to chime in. Obviously, it's also an opportunity for any others to do so about whatever issues you think should be put on the table for the first time, or matters you want to go back to. I think we should take seriously the opportunity to fold one session back on the other and problems and issues that we've addressed. The one thing I would ask is that we, at least for the moment, pay attention to, as in taking a bird's eye view or perspective, pay attention to what may have been at issue or at stake in using these sort of pointed, broad but pointed refractory questions, to use them to get at the larger set of issues or the larger topic for the seminar. So, having said that, I really want to privilege first anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak or a few opportunities to speak. Here's your opportunity. Let's begin.
One thing that I thought this morning as we were talking about ways to think about working against sort of dominating discourse or something that scripturalized kind of situation. We set ourselves up in a certain way to look for opportunities or possibilities of liberation, and there's a valence to that which is positive, things that we like, right, that we want to see, voices that aren't heard, being heard, or ways of conceiving knowledge that aren't acknowledged, being heard. But I kept thinking about, because it was you started this morning, making reference to the folks here in Oregon who took over a federal, like, that's not something that I'll say to myself, at least, I don't find that a liberating sort of discourse, or a sort of a liberative sort of act, right? But how would we, for ourselves, find a way to distinguish that from things that we do like in a way that is intellectually honest, right? There are people, turning the tools of a scripturalized society against the text they're using. We said this, the Bible and the Constitution. Why didn't it work, right? And why do we look at that and think that's one thing that we don't like? And there are other places where we would want to see something like that work. I don't have an answer for this, but I just kept coming back to, if we really want to talk about imagining something different, right? Imagining something outside of a dominating discourse. Maybe it looks like that, and then if it does, sometimes how do we critique that in an honest way, right? So that's where I was kind of left this morning.
Great, thank you.
That reminds me, not to just as I know obviously I've talked about it, but it reminds me of Bruno Latour's argument, why is critique run out of steam? I sort of, how these things that we're describing, how do we honestly not implicate ourselves in the things that that are done in our name, right? And I don't remember the essay, but the Israeli military, for example, studies postmodern architecture and better ways for disrupting Palestinian communities. They're like 10 moves ahead of us, right? We're here talking about this history and the politics. They've done that. They've co-opted that, and they, and now they've loaded into their rifles. So yeah, I hear you, but I don't know. Don't have an answer.
Anyone else?
Another you're getting at it's some sort of a caution then that we can slip so easily into this scripturalizing is great, this, you know, and so to kind of be aware of this very important, I think, but I'm not sure that that is part of the project as I understand it, so it's important to guard against, so that it's, you know, that's how I practically agree with
Okay, great.
Well, it seems like when people invoke decentralization, decentralized, regimes, I mean, the people who try to found alternatives. I love things like this library where books have been bought by the yard because you find things you'll find nowhere else that everyone else has thrown out. And there's a book that was a reminiscence of 1929 in Russia. And talking about, the top-down regime change in terms that were very much like all of these, discourses, and it just seems like being willing to hear things you don't want to hear, but making sure that a whole lot of voices are being included. Because we have a kind of a Coke and Pepsi situation now where difference is not difference substantive.
Robert, is that your?
Well, it seems to me that, so I think I'm agreeing with Gray that there should be no cultural phenomenon should be hands-off. I mean, everything should be available for study. I'm thinking of the way that in 1925 that the Scopes trial captured the American interest in a podunk town. It has to do with what is being perceived and understanding where people come from. You might not tie into it at that point or not, but everyone has a voice and everybody has a story. Every group has a story. Whether that story is significant enough to comment on, you can't prejudge that. You almost have to. That comes afterwards, I think. So.
What if you took it to the extreme and thought of like a neo-Nazi group that's Holocaust denying and just the thinking the most abhorrent worldview, or you can imagine? Is there a moment where, and I don't know, I'm just asking if there's a moment you can just say, we don't even want to give you a podium?
Well, so a couple things. Number one, so now podiums, we're now moving into a different, to kind of different classification. But just in terms of trying to understand people, I think Hitler would be a fascinating study to be able to understand. So we have to be careful on when we're occluding or excluding, because that, to me, that easily morphs. Now we're getting back to who. Now the question of who, and in terms of meaning and stuff. So I think we have to be a little careful. Now, giving them a platform would be another thing, but at least in terms of trying to understand, is how I think.
Well, are there issues and, well, let me start over. How would we begin to draw the strings together? Or can we do that? What might the conversations, the different conversations, add up to? One of us might think of it in this way: what things have we been forced to think about as a result of this interaction? Perhaps for some the first time, or along slightly different lines. So there are different ways of trying to get at that. But far short of anything like closure, I wonder if we could begin thinking back on our thinking. Sure.
Richard.
I think one of the I think one of the scary implications of our conversation is that the example of the neo-Nazi or whomever, like when you really take Ron Sierra seriously and the sort of potentiality of scripturalization, we are likely doing acts that others are going to find fantastically horrible. And we're so good at it that we forget we've done it. And I think this sort of one of the critiques of ISS is that challenged for reflexivity, thinking about not only our own stories, but also the way that our stories are comparable to others, even the other that we really would never want to be in the same sentence with, right? So I mean, and I think that's a very, in some ways it's a really small step, but it's also perhaps the largest step, right? That you remain consistently interested in seeing your enemy as also you.
Right. Yeah.
Now, simply, in terms of what was just said, I think what's very important, I think, is for me, is to allow us, ourselves, and our readings to be interrupted by other readings. How could I imagine? And or even if it is Hitler or neo-Nazis, which doesn't mean that we are done then, but in the same time allowing us to be interrupted and then recognizing we have made interpretive choices. And therefore we cannot claim authority on our reading as well.
I think a focus on discussing foreign social relations would be a good. One way to go about it, to engage other voices that we may not totally agree with politically.
I think, and that's a huge problem. How do you talk about scripturalization without scripturalizing what you're doing? And at least in my mind, where you have to stay, you have to be very self-reflexive, super self-reflexive, painfully so. And you have to stay at that level where you're just looking at the processes. You might have to be super careful about drawing conclusions about the processes. Because once that starts to happen, if we don't do it in such a fashion that it's very clear that we're saying this is what we gather from this and this is why, then it becomes itself a scripture. It's really hard to keep this sort of thing from turning into an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if there's a good answer for that, other than to just be aware of that tendency and avoid it at all costs.
John?
Just to follow up on Tamara's point, I mean, I'm sure many of you in this room know there's really a considerable literature in sociology of knowledge about this problem of self-reflexivity. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a very successful assault on the problem. Mannheim in Ideology and Utopia makes a pretty good attempt, but it is a problem, and I myself have never really seen anyone come to grips with it, except for Seth's example of the chair, holding a chair that you're standing on. But I'd like to add, as someone who's come from outside the ISS grouping, I found this fascinating because my orientation has been to use discursive analysis, or archaeology, if you will, except Foucault's term, to solve a specific problem. It's a tool. You know, I follow C. Wright Mills' teaching on social studies. You find the tool you need for the problem you're trying to solve, and that's what you do. What I've encountered here, which is I found really fascinating, challenging, and a bit uncomfortable, is the desire to generalize that methodological approach to really big questions that are essentially open-ended. The who, in particular, the what, the when, the how. So for me, it's been an interesting journey of dedicating this approach to a specific problem, i.e. why do we think about Muslims the way we do, and why don't we think another way? And taking that tool, which I think fit very well, that's my argument, and watching my colleagues in this room generalize that to a global application. So that's my observation.
Travis, still
No.
You know, I guess I just, maybe this is another permutation of jaded, I don't know, but the older I mean, the more I'm around generalizing, it's not that I want to just go to the other side of the boat for the particular, but I think I'd like to, in the face of theory, speak up for the unpretentious. That the people that I've actually learned the most from are the people who've taught me that you can live a well-lived life in terms of relationships with other people if most of the things I thought I had to have were taken away. And how they still manage to live with grace. You know, and it comes down to sometimes that if I'm on the Long Island Railroad, all the business people are like this, and they get mad if you have a big suitcase from the airport. And if you're on the subway with a bunch of people going to a not very good Puerto Rican neighborhood, everybody helps you with the suitcase. And so, I mean, to me, that's the place where it really lives. And only those aspects of theories that help me to appreciate this kind of grace of living and how people manage to fashion that in the face of power is, you know, that's where I would get the strength to say, okay, well, I'm very privileged, so, you know, maybe I must speak about this.
Actually, going up what Grace said, and this is something that I, and Vincent knows as well, that I've struggled with from the very beginning, of just even coming back to academia, is, you know, who are we talking to, you know, and the sort of the pitfalls and the power associated with a certain kind of sort of technically precise jargon. And I, you know, I've spun myself around on this question a lot because of you know, my own pretensions and sort of the pretensions of people that I really like, you know, that I enjoy, you know, having these conversations with. And you know, what it sort of brought me back around recently is we're talking to each other, right? We're trying to give each other the tools for doing this because most of the people in the world already know that it's rigged, right? So Jenner Truth knew, right? She didn't need to read. I mean, this has been since, you know, I mean, use this as an example a lot. I mean, if we were to go to Haiti right now, right? We're just in Haiti. They know. They don't need me to tell them that what I'm about is not what they're about. What I'm about is, you know, sort of keeping myself calm. They don't need me to tell them that. They've already figured that out. Who hasn't figured it out is if we can sort of be the metonymy like us. Like, we haven't figured that out. We think we're liberating students when when they come into our classrooms. We think, you know, by handing over Foucault or whomever we're privileging, and not that we're doing that in our dialogues, but you know, I work against that in myself. Right? I have to work against, like, well, footnote. You know, so anyway, so that it's. I mean, when you say that, I hear exactly what you're saying.
I want to
say something about what we learn in the informal break time of meetings like this. That in the meetings themselves, I think you're right, although we're an enormously diverse group in terms of age and geography and backgrounds, there's still a certain kind of consonance of understanding that this is the way the world is, that pretty much sustains throughout this group. But what we know is that the universe is always full of surprises. It just is. And in talking with people last night at dinner and then again today, this morning, these things come up that are just exemplary of why you have to be open and why, although you have a certain lens that you bring to everything you do, you have to be open to the fact that there are these changes. And one of them that happened today was just the most exquisite example of this kind of thing. And I was talking to Camera about twins, and we all have twins in our families, and she was talking about these identical twins in her family who've been identical their whole lives, and so identical that they could take each other's places, and they did in some very surprising and very challenging moments. But one of them is becoming bald,
Yep.
and the other one is not.
Suddenly they're different.
So, how does that happen? That's anti-biology. It's anti-everything we know. There's a little quirk in that DNA somewhere. They will no longer be able to pose as one another, but there's also the question of how does that happen? They were one egg, one sperm, that divided, and somewhere in there, one of them was losing his hair. And, you know, that's very fantastic, you know? And I thought it was fantastic, aside from all the other twin stories, you know. So that kind of thing you learn about when you have a few minutes to listen to each other and each other's experience. So I'm really very grateful for that. This used to happen when I was teaching. It happens sometimes when you're teaching students, and a few examples in my head about that. But I'm not teaching anymore. Once in a while, sub for somebody. Mm-hmm. And so I prize this kind of opportunity to be kind of re-informed of how open the universe is. And it always sends you off to study something. Now that I heard this story, you know, I want to look into that. I know some people who are genetic engineers, and I want to find out, how is this?
Find out, let me know. I'm sure my cousin
I
would like to know
will.
why he's
I will email you. There's a new center for genetic engineering at the University of Chicago. So my 13-year-old granddaughter wrote to me. She lives in Denver. And she said, I did this science project on Dolly the sheep. You remember that, those of you? The cloned, completely cloned. And she said, I read that one of the experts in the ethics of cloning is at the University of Chicago, and I wonder if you know him. Well, I do know him. I do. And he's agreed to talk with her. He's this internationally famous guy. He says, well, she's a novice genetic engineer. So, you know, he's going to talk to her, and she's going to do her project. And this, so now I'm getting back to him because I want to find out about the twins. But it's just this assertion, really, that the various inquiries of the session leaders have raised. I'm very interested in politics, so the political implications of canon setting, you know, have a great deal of interest for me. So I'm going to look very carefully at the papers, people. We go away from here not just with our memories of the conversations, but these papers. and we can read and reread them and see what directions they lead us in. We're all researchers, so it'll have a kind of multi-tentacled application for us. So that's something to take home.
Anyone else? Please. All right, Robert?
So I go to this church, and the pastor of the church has been asking me about the ISS, you know, so he's a pretty educated guy, went to Claremont years ago. And, but he's asking about the ISS, you know, so he said that so he picked up a couple of books, I guess maybe probably a couple books of yours, Vincent. And so he got back to me this last week, and he says, you know, I still don't get it, you know. And, you know, it seems like the whole idea of scripturalization is just way too broad. You know, I mean, this is a typical response. I've heard, I don't know, you probably have heard these responses too. So I think one of the things that would be important, a part of the agenda anyway, is to make it, to try and be as, to think in terms of who we are writing for or to, or who's going to be reading. I guess it's a question of, here we go again, who's going to be reading our, you know, reading our stuff, and to try and bring clarity, something clear enough that someone outside the in group would be able to catch it.
Well, I hope you'll work on that.
And let me just say,
I'll jump in on that because I've got kind of the same impulse in my life right now. Part of my dissertation proposal that my committee, when they first had my proposal back to me, they suggested that I, even in my proposal, explain scripturalization more because I have two people, even from CGU, who are outside of the program, and so they aren't intimately familiar with the background. And so as part of my proposal, my introductory chapter is going to be explaining scripturalization more and even
when I try to swim with the tide in the languaging of what the ISS is doing. And at some point I had to repent, you know, and agree that it seems that there is, should I say, a natural niche that the ISS is carving out for itself. So, especially as scholars and academics, so we saw that that is how to market what you're talking about. So that is what puts you here. So if you reword it like Rob's pastor was suggesting, then it removes, it appears, ISS from being ISS into this, like the others. So I don't know, the question therefore would be, would we presuppose that there is embedded within the agenda of the ISS the intention to, in fact, not make everybody understand it?
Richard wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hear and perhaps have lived some of the things in my own way, kind of hearing these critiques and whatnot. I have to also say that in my sort of teaching experience, I've actually found people to be quite receptive to the sort of questions and the freedom to question, right? To ask why this canon, you know, and to give them the freedom to sort of run with where they're going. That's actually been really compelling to me. It kind of reminds me, oh yeah, answers sometimes are kind of played out. Actually, I think that's a paraphrase of you. Like the questions, right? Like asking the more basic, the more simple, the more fundamental question that reminds you to feel what it's like to be a problem. I think that the space and creating the circles to do that is, in my mind, sort of the hallmark of the ISS experience, if you will, rather than any sort of bibliography. I mean, the bibliography is a tool to get there, right? But there's also other tools out there, and that's why we need something broad. You know, not, oh, you haven't read this, you're not up on this, so you're not in here. Rather, it's the other sort of, what can you help us see that we might be missing, or see that has been here all along that we haven't noticed. So I think it can be a different sort of knowledge production, a different sort of understanding of what it means to learn and to ask, and which sorts of things matter.
Okay, great.
I just think it happens differently at different times in your life as well, you know, where you are. I find it, I try to recruit, and I've just become tongue-tied. It's because I think partly I don't have any kind of religious studies foil or history to say, look at this sort of normative practices of interpretation and exegesis and this and that. And so I would find it helpful if there were maybe some accounts starting at the other end, because any the kinds of compatibilities I feel with the group come from starting at the other end, which is that here I have this problem, anomaly, you know, thing on the ground where I see the world being limited for people, and then if I poke at it, there's going to be usually some kind of scripturalizing, or what we call that. That's part of what's making that happen. But it's coming from a problem-driven place. I've never had any, you know, commitment to kind of the more abstract world. That, I mean, I just pick. I'm with C. Wright Mills. I guess that's what I'm saying. That's always how I've operated. That really resonated with me. Find the tools that work at a given time to try to understand things, and try to find the tools that interrupt my common sense first view of what was happening. And so it's really helpful for that. But you know, I can see why people have trouble reading the website or something.
Is that James? Is that a hand up?
It wasn't, no. But
it could be.
It could be. Well, I was thinking, I mean, there's certain empirically oriented things that I've latched onto and, you know, been messing around with in my notes that I found really fruitful in the conversation. I mean, one thing I've said to a couple of people throughout the weekend is that, or the time, is that, you know, there's something really, you know, both refreshing and frustrating about the free space that this is. And you know, I'm choosing to concentrate on the refreshing part. Yeah. And so I'm really bolstered by that, and I'm really grateful for the couple of days. But beyond that, like looking ahead is the comment I guess I'd make that ties together, you know, something Gray said toward the end of the last session, which is, you know, putting things out there, you know, into a broader audience, whether that's public scholarship or whatever. And then, you know, my example being what Katie put forward of this process that we're going to see unfold in the next year, and maybe longer, who knows, of replacing Supreme Court justice in a way, you know, at a time that words like originalism and textualism are on the headlines. You know, I think we see the, you know, we as scholars see the expressions and the artifacts of textualism and originalism all the time, but so explicitly in the headlines. You know, this is an opportunity. I mean, I think this is a moment when the ISS has something very distinctive to contribute to public conversation, and to let that go by and only talk about it 5 years from now would be a mistake. I don't know that I'm volunteering to lead the charge, but sorry, Jason's point, I would be keen to interact with people and talk about ways to capitalize on the discourses that we're gonna see spinning out with increasing volume about a new justice and what their disposition is toward the text and how they read and what they do with the text and what power it has or doesn't have, and all these questions that we can speak to and speak to directly. So that's a long way of saying, if anybody wants to chat about an analysis of that kind over the next year, I'm game. And
Can we call it a new justice? That's really
I
resonates.
haven't even been positioned.
Can and we will, yeah.
I thank Gray for pointing us in that direction, and I thank Katie for that example.
Is a predicament. So I wonder how many of us realized that someone like Justice Scalia loses his humanity in becoming a sign and symbol for people to such a degree that his dying leaves no human mark. That hours after he died, a political discussion ensued with enormous fervor, and there might be one line that lamented that he had passed away. It was almost as though that was incidental to this immediate shift in power, potential shift in power. And I wondered if all of the people on the Supreme Court become that, or if just you be on there one time and then you become that, or if you're particularly intransigent, you become that, or what is it that enables a whole nation to stop looking at you as a person?
I guess in my mind, the question immediately appears
New justice as the name for thinking or bringing to bear what the ISS does as an opportunity and even an obligation to intervene, to find ways to be part of a whole process that is larger than simply the academy as a thing the ISS would want to do. And there's another way in which the desire of the ISS to engage an extra-American community of international participation. It's clear to me that when many of you speak about Scalia, that's deep in your bones, but it isn't in mine. I get it abstractly, but it's like, oh, here we go again on another one of those, in my parochial language, typically American debates, which I rapidly lose interest in, not because I'm unaware of the power dynamics, but there is a way in which it is not a universal problem. It is not even an international problem, whatever its international ramifications are. So to me, just strategically, I don't think one cancels the other out, but I think there's a need to somehow intervene, take up the question of a new justice, engage a thing that's obviously important in the American context, but to do it in a way that kind of shows this is not everybody's problem. We're using it because it's both an example, but also because, in a way, you'd be inviting others to join you without presupposing they're with you in the same dilemma. How to do that, how to have a conversation that is both passionately engaged with one's own immediate context, but to do it in an open way so that others who don't share the dilemma have a chance to get interested in it. I think that's just strategically a thing the ISS would have to figure out how to do in order for its other desire, namely to be not just a parochial conversation, to have a chance to succeed. But in a sense, the more it takes for granted that something like Scalia is self-evidently important, there's a way in which I think what you gain in the short term, you lose in the long term. So how you put those two together is, I think, something one would want to think about.
All right, quickly, David.
So, well, thank you for mentioning the international idea, that perspective too. That was very helpful. But I was thinking also that the late Justice, he is a product, or was a product, of the community, a text reading community. So the idea of either giving him praises or condemnation apart from the community where he comes from and represents, and at some point try to supersede in how and about how texts are being read, I think is something that we need to be careful about in doing. We talked earlier on about power, whether the defined, whether they have any kind of power, or the definer. You know, in this sense, we should also look at it. We're seeing him simply as a definer, rather than also having been a defined himself. A community of text reading community defined him. And I have in my mind, while I was saying that, some recent judgments in Nigeria by Nigeria's Supreme Court. So the president, the outgoing president, first time in Africa, president conceding defeat, right? Elections were not even over, so he called the opponent, and his supporters were dazed and congratulated the opponent. So he knew what he has got from security details, what the US was going to do to him, whether he won or lost. They don't want him there again. Well, he considered, but afterwards, other state governors who had won on his platform were being one after the other eliminated. It was like a Hitler that's just come on the throne, and everybody who is in the other party has to be wiped out. So the big deal, the Supreme Court delivered about 2 judgments that were not in favor of the ruling party, the current ruling party. Now, they turned on the justices of the Supreme Court and started checking their phone records to find corruption, because on these 2 key states that represented oil drilling, areas, right? They don't want to lose them, and things are escalating here and there. But what am I saying? This president, he's representing a particular regime, a regime that knows that we have to keep power at all costs, up to him going on a national TV, and declaring that I don't obey court judgments if the person has committed bigger crime. So I determine that. So we need to look at it from that, context of production. Yeah.
All right, Richard.
I'll yield to Jackie. Sorry.
Okay.
I'll yield to Jackie.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I more want to say, I wanted to thank you both for your comments, because Leif, I had an immediate reaction that was sort of like yours, but different. It's like, yes, I think it would be great if ISS can be used to talk about the likes of Scalia and whatnot, but only in as much as it domesticates him, actually shows how, how particular and not universal and not unique he is. Because on the flip side of that, I have to say that yes, absolutely, the only reason I signed on to ISS so many years ago was so that there would be a space where I did not have to talk about Scalia. I did not have to talk about what white evangelicals were doing with the Bible, because I'm happy that other people talk about it, but I'm like, it's, not my people, and I really am tired of being told I have to care about them, right? So it's one of those things where it's like, it's great, it would be great only in as much as it's one of the many sorts of projects that ISS can foster to show and like I said, again, to kind of show how Scalia is one instantiation of a particular other sort of frame that's not universalizable, but is a bigger web in the sort of human, larger human. Sorry.
All right, I want to just express my thanks to all of you for your participation in these rounds. This has been, as I said, very rich. I've appreciated the interaction, learned much from all of you, and I have been inspired and provoked by arguments and statements made. We'll have to leave it where we're leaving it in terms of, for now, in terms of a discussion of issues around the questions that have refracted the whole problematic of meaning, used as a way to get us thinking about our own thinking and operations and agenda and alliances and commitments. And I'm appreciative of your participation. And of course, the conversation can continue in so many, between the cracks of the program. We should